Okay, so let's start. Welcome to our first colloquium of the year. It's really a great pleasure for us to start the series with Matt Hall. And Matt is professor of public policy and sociology and director of the Cornell Population Center. He is also the director of the firm on applied demographics, which is something that we're interested in investigating. Matt received his PhD from Penn State University. He's one of the leading figures in the literature of immigrant adaptation and immigrant incorporation. He crosses both the literature of immigration and the literature on race and ethnicity, especially around issues of settlement, segregation, spatial attainment. And so his work is actually very interesting in bridging those two literatures as he investigates Latino incorporations. He has done a lot of work on new immigrant destinations and how it connects with segregation and adaptation. And now he's investigating more the role of policing and immigration, the persecution of immigrants, and what effects this has on adaptation, including segregation. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Matt Hall to come.
Well, thank you, Emilio, and thanks for having me here on the start of your Colloquium series. I want to share some work today that I've been working on with Jake Brew, who's at BYU, and Howling, who's a graduate student at Cornell, that we've been working on for a few years now, that's investigating the impact of local immigration enforcement on various measures of economic and social well-being of Latinos. Obviously this is a timely conversation, and so we hope that we can contribute some evidence to understand kind of just the devastating effects of some of these policies that we're having on it. So there are two broad demographic trends that define or describe the Latino population over the course of the last several decades. And the one you're seeing on the left, of course, is just the rapid growth of this population, right? That is, it's the most fastest growing major racial and ethnic group in the U.S., and it is and projected to continue to grow, right? And so and this is of course a result of immigration in the post 65 era, but also particularly through fertility in the second and later generations of. The other trend that many in this room have contributed to is the geographic dispersion of the immigrant population and the Latino population, in particular, throughout the entire country. You can see here on the map on the right is just showing you the kind of the hotspots of where the Hispanic population grew over the last about 10 years or 15 years. Is not in California and Texas and Chicago, but throughout the Sun Belt, right, throughout the Southern Atlantic region, in Georgia and North Carolina, in Tennessee, and throughout the Great Plains and parts of the Pacific Northwest. And so this has led to this, this growing literature on the emergence of new destinations, of course, but it's also changed the political landscape of immigration and immigration enforcement in ways that are going to be particularly relevant here. Now, these trends have, the focus of this project is on residential segregation, right? The extent to which groups occupy the same spaces of a city or spaces of a community. And what we know from that literature is that black-white segregation has declined. It's still quite high, but has declined pretty steadily over the course of the last 40 years. And is actually now, for kind of the first time, below that kind of threshold of what we think of as of high segregation. And so there's been these steady declines in black segregation. Hispanic segregation, Latino segregation has been, in contrast, fairly stable over that time period, although over the last couple decades, there's been some signs of reductions. And so there have been, you can see in the last 2 decades, there's these somewhat parallel declines. Actually, some more recent work that I've been doing shows that these declines are probably even larger. The Latino populations, the Latino segregation is on the decline. And this is, there's lots of different ways that we can characterize segregation. This is through the kind of the most common measure, dissimilarity. But you see it when you pick up on other similar measures. Now, one of the more striking features of our immigration enforcement system, really over the course of the last 20 years, but especially so in the last 10 months, has been the incredible levels of mass deportation that have defined our immigration system. And so this is showing you we don't actually have great recent data, and so this is a few years old, but then you can imagine where these levels would be today if we had the data. But what we know from the recent past is that between about 2003 and 2017, there were about 5 million people that were removed through the deportation process. And at its peak in the kind of the end of Obama's first term, were deportation levels that were about 400,000 people per year. And so there's, the scale of these numbers is truly incredible, and the impact that these have on population structures, but also on the communities, more importantly, in the immigrant communities, but also the broader communities that they are part of, is colossal. And of course, we know that the vast majority of those that were part of this deportation system are Mexican and Central American, and so it's highly concentrated among the segment of the population. I should also feel free to interject, because I'm in a policy school that's mostly economists, so I'm used to being interrupted constantly. So feel free to raise questions.
Do we know much about the demographics of who was deported? I mean, were people deported after they've been here for 6 months or 20 years or?
Yeah, so there were different priorities the different administrations had on who to target. The Obama administration was very explicit and very targeted in removing folks that had histories of violent crime. And so some of those were people that had been in the country for many years. There was also kind of an administrative change in how removals were being handled at the border. I think kind of an expansion of what we think of as the border area. And so some of that reflects those administrative changes as well. But it's a mix. And obviously today it's encompassing a much larger segment of the population. There is data on migrants flowing on either direction of the border, and so you can look at kind of how the demographic profile has shifted over that. Okay, now one of the most important features of this mass deportation system is that this growth, particularly the growth during the 2000s and the teens, was driven by a devolution of enforcement to local jurisdictions. Okay, that is the changes in how interior enforcement policy was being executed is what really drove the change in our deportations. So this is related to, there were changes at the border, but really what was happening were the changes that were happening interior. And some of this was political resistance from local communities, but it was also strategies that ICE was taking in order to address unauthorized populations. And so we saw, for instance, just that the number of deportations during that time period surged, or the number of deportations that were due to interior techniques, local techniques, grew rapidly during that time period. And these effects really extend well beyond those who are directly deported or impacted, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, but they involve the people that share households with people who are unauthorized. They include family members that are reliant on incomes of those folks, but also the broader community is going to be heavily impacted by the chilling effects that exist in this space.
Beyond that, for course.
Yes. Not on a large scale, no. What we have, and I'll show you here, is we don't even have data on deportations. We have show you the policy design that we're using here. We have information on a program that was meant to lead to deportation. We also have information on what are called detainers, right? And so that these are typically issued by ICE, sometimes by local jurisdictions to detain somebody on an immigration charge.
What's the role of the Secure Communities program? My understanding is that these programs were phased out in part because Obama, the Secure Communities basically took over, and that's how Obama reached such high numbers of deportations. That was
So I can come back to explain it and maybe answer the question better, but they're secure communities and 287G are related, but they're distinct. The Secure Communities program is now actually exists in every county in the country. It's a jail-based program that sets up the infrastructure for ICE to make those detainer requests at jails. So when someone is processed in a jail, their fingerprints are sent not only to the FBI, but now they're also sent to ICE. And ICE, it builds that infrastructure. The rollout of secure communities at ESCOM was a little bit later than the onset of 287G. So they are overlapping. We've done a bunch of robustness checks, and it's not like what we're finding here is not driven by secure communities, but they are overlapping.
Yeah.
And I can show you when I show you the map that I'll put up in a minute. I can talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so what is the 287G program that I'm so 287G? Many people have probably heard about it before, but it is a piece of it was a section 287G of the 1996 immigration legislation, the illegal immigrant responsibilities. It always has responsibility in it, and I can't remember the reform act. Yeah. But it was just a section of that allowed MOUs to be set up between local authorities, local agencies, and immigration authorities. Okay. Now, originally, it actually was kind of a dormant passage of this legislation. It wasn't even the first. Salt Lake City tried to create an MOU in the late 90s. Florida set up an MOU in the wake of 9/11 as a way to kind of track suspected terrorist suspects. But it wasn't until kind of the Tea Party era that the program was seen as an effective tool to police unauthorized migrants. And actually, it started in Mecklenburg, North Carolina. The program there was piloted explicitly as a way for local communities as a tool or a weapon to enforce immigration law. And then the MOU that was signed in Mecklenburg County was actually used as a model, as a template for, and actually the sheriff of Mecklenburg was put in charge as the chief ICE coordinator for these immigration for these MOUs. And so it was kind of carbon copied, throughout a lot of different areas, particularly in the South. That was, and again, it was designed to police immigrant communities. Now, what does it actually do? It, like I said, it allows agencies to develop MOUs with local authorities. And why is that important? Well, one piece is that to remember that violations of immigration law are not violations of criminal law. It's not a criminal offense to be undocumented in the United States, right? And so police don't have jurisdiction over immigration law. And so what this 287G does, or the way that these agreements are signed, is they effectively deputize cops, or they allow for a process to deputize cops as immigration agents. So they have the ability to detain people, to question people about their immigration status, to detain people from those responsibilities, and to initialize that they're not actually deporting people, but they're building the infrastructure in order to do that. I'll show you a map of where these are signed, but in total, this reached about 250 agencies. So these are, for the most part, local county sheriff's offices. But there's some variation on this. There are a few states that have state level programs, but there are various, but for the most part, these are local agencies. Now, as Emilio said, this ramped up during the kind of that Tea Party era, the first part of the Obama administration, and it was phased out in the second term of the Obama administration, and then it resurfaced immediately, actually, when Trump gained office in the first term, and has actually in the last year has exploded, and particularly in Texas and Florida and elsewhere. So what we're going to try to connect is how this program in particular, the 287G program, is a proxy for heightened levels of enforcement and deportation, and how that might relate to segregation. And the conceptual framework we're thinking of looks something like this. And it starts from the assumption, or what we know about segregation, is that segregation changes only when migration changes, right? That for segregation to change, there has to be a fundamental transformation in the way that people move throughout a city or a community, or the different types of people moving in and out of the city. So segregation, the underlying basics of segregation is really about movement. It's really about differential movement or differential migration. And so that's our argument, is that this policy and the deportations should lead to different shifts in migration behaviors. And the way that we're thinking about this is both through kind of the direct effects of deportation and the indirect effects. And so the direct effects, we know that interior enforcement should lead to a surge in deportations. We know that the intermediate pathway is a surge in these detainers that we can test, and that those will have consequences for those families and for those individuals. But we also know that there's big chilling effects of these policies on the Latino community in particular, on immigrant communities. There is extensive research that shows that kind of related policies and enforcement and hostile policy climates leads to mental distress among Latino families, leads to absenteeism among children in schools, and has a host of other indicators that are pointing to stress as a proximate cause. And we also know that these policies have been associated with reductions in the labor supply of Latino workers. They've been associated with reductions in the wages for workers who are likely to be undocumented, and other associated impacts that are going to impact the broader community as well. So those direct, those deportations are going to impact migration in a couple of ways, and the obvious path is this one here, right? That people who are deported are removed from a community, and so there's that path. But there's also the kind of the related impacts that exist when somebody is detained or deported within a home. We know, for instance, that a large number of actually a majority of Latino of undocumented households are in mixed status settings, right? So they're living in homes with not just other immigrants, but often native-born individuals, and they're in households that are more diverse than we might think about kind of stereotypically. And so those homes or those households are often reliant on that income. So if somebody is removed from that home, that's a loss of income, and it might prompt a residential move. And there is just very good evidence on the impacts of things like worksite raids, even on related policies, on 287G and related policies that show clear signs that there is actually income loss happening associated with this. And some other work that Jake and I have done, we found that this same pathway can be linked to increases in Latino home foreclosure that is again tied to income loss. And of course, this is compounded by the substantial legal fees that are often associated with detention. Okay, and then the combination of all of these things we think is going to combine to spur residential change. There's what I would call, like I have up here, fairly mixed evidence on the impact of various policies, including 287G, including work by Emilio and others, on migration. There's some evidence that it has reduced the size of the unauthorized population. There's other evidence to suggest that it have not reduced that size. But there is at least some indications that there are migration related outcomes. Like I mentioned before, there's actually quite good evidence that a range of policies, including 287G, but also raids, including recent ones, are related to reduced enrollment of Latino kids. And what we do know about those who are more likely to leave are that they tend to be kind of more higher income Latinos than not. And then we argue that these same sorts of dynamics should be at play not only with movement out of an area altogether, but also with the kind of the residential or the local moves that people embark on, right? And importantly, that they should be related in a way that should lead people into more isolating neighborhoods, to neighborhoods that are that have more poverty, but that also have higher Latino concentrations that again should connect with different levels of segregation. Okay, so how are we going to do this? So we're using, like I mentioned, the 287G program, and the way that we are doing this is we're going to compare counties. Yes, all counties. We're going to compare counties that we're only going to, let me back up. We're only going to look at counties that applied to participate in this program. And we know that information because Juan Petroza, who many of you might know, collected FOIAs through DHS on the actual MOU agreements that were submitted to apply for participation on 287G. So we have all those MOUs. We have all the applications for the MOUs, including the year it was drafted, the year it was entered into agreement and was done, the type of agreement that was signed. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then of course the outcome. This is, like I said, it's almost exclusively counties. There are some municipal agreements. There also are some state agreements. We've actually, and we played around with we tested all these different iterations, and I'm happy to expand on that. So in total through about 2020, so this isn't capturing the most recent period, but you can see what the map looks like. There's, a pretty diverse range of areas where these places have been both implemented and what we're calling rejected. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the rejected are the yellow ones. The rejected are both a combination of areas that were rejected by DHS and areas that withdrew their applications. And so we unfortunately don't have good information on why those applications were withdrawn or rejected. We know a little bit. We know that DHS has said that the most common reason was that they didn't believe that the police department had the resources or the capacity to support the detainers that would be associated with this. So we've played around with this, been looking at the size of the police agency as a particular confounder. All of our models control for police agency size. But it is one potential source of bias that we're not able to kind of fully disentangle. But at least what we know about this design is that we know at least all of these areas had a taste for this sort of aggressive immigration enforcement system, right? And so at least we can make those comparisons to help generate what we think of as something closer to a plausibly plausible estimate. And so when we do that and we look at segregation, this captures a little bit of what it looks like. So again, we're using counties. A lot of these places you can see here, these are not all in big metropolitan areas. There's a lot of rural areas and that are included here. So because of that, we can't do what's traditionally done in segregation, and you use a big metropolitan area, you slice it up into census tracts, and then you compare those census tracts. in these rural areas, there might be 4 census tracts, you know, and so we have to use decennial data. We use census blocks, which are very small geographic units. And we calculate segregation, dissimilarity from whites within counties based on those census blocks. And when you graph this, what you see is that, so that remember the purple are the implemented counties, the counties that implemented the program. The green are what we're calling the rejected counties, and then all the grayed out ones are all the other counties. And there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. One is that, well, I should emphasize, this is segregation in 2000, segregation in 2020. So the yellow line is showing you if segregation was exactly the same in 2000 and 2020, they'd all be lined up right along that line. Okay. So, but what you see is that most of these circles are all below the line. So segregation was declining across the country for the most part over this period. But what you also see is that in the areas that implemented the program, right, the purple ones, they tended to decline a little less than in areas that rejected the program. Okay, and so that's the comparison that we're going to leverage here. Now we're going to look at a few different ways, ways that we think this relationship might be moderated. One is the timing of those policies. So as I mentioned, there was this kind of early period where that Mecklenburg County blueprint was being used throughout the country, and particularly throughout the New South. So that was one area where we know that there were kind of particularly aggressive forms of the MOUs at least were aggressive, were written in a way that were kind of particularly aggressive, and or it was the counties that we suspect were likely to be aggressive that were participating in the program. There was the kind of the Obama period, and then there was the kind of the first part of the Trump administration. And so we're going to kind of separate the timing out of those areas. We're also going to look at the Southern Atlantic, the New South region separately from other areas. These, as I mentioned before, these agreements took three different forms, but 2 basic ones. And one was that it was kind of jail-based, right? That actually looks very much like secure communities. Whereas the police or the task force model was one where cops beat cops were actually acting in ways that were more like immigration agents. That was, yeah.
Do you have any data on county jails in this analysis?
We have, you mean in terms of like capacity? Yeah. I know that, so I know in our final models, we include our measure of law enforcement capacity is based on police officers. We did at one point look at jails.
So like county sheriff's department, the sheriff also runs the jail. The reimbursement rate was like $90 per day, right? From the federal government. But it comes up to $1 a day to hold it in.
Yeah.
So they had a financial incentive to tell sheriff's deputies to stop people and see if they learn. So I'm curious, if you look at a lot of these rural counties, you might find some differentiation just based on how this policy creates an incentive to essentially, police immigration and make money off of.
Yeah, it's a great idea. And it's a great, we don't have data on those reimbursement rates, I think across.
Flat, pretty sure.
Right, well, like the kind of the convergence, yeah. But yeah, that's absolutely true, that there were, on top of political pressures, there is a possibility that there were financial.
It's like $88 a day in LA, just like losing the county money, but I think some of these rural areas, it becomes the source of revenue, right?
Yep. Great point. So again, so we're going to look back at the form of these agreements, and then we're also going to look at the number of local detainers which come from the track database, the track clearinghouse at Syracuse, transactional research access clearinghouse. I think that's right, but it's an operation that FOIAs the federal government and collects and has a kind of incredible database on immigration and criminal justice related outcomes. And one of the things that they have is we have the number of detainers issued within that county by year that we can use as kind of a measure of the intensity the effort. And then, you know, we don't, our conceptual framework is again that this is moving through migration. So we think of migration as kind of the important mechanism that's at play here. We look very crudely at a couple different measures of migration, both kind of out-migration, county out-migration, and local residential moves among the Latino population. I can talk more about how we construct those. It's based on census data in a few different ways. But it gives us these measures of how much movement there is in and out of places, and then how much movement there is within a place. And then how that's changed over time, of course. We're going to include a handful of controls related to the size of the community, median household income, the share of the population that is Latino, the percent foreign-born, the average size of the household, Hispanic households, and then commuting patterns among Latinos, since driving was one of the kind of the risk factors in these communities. And then, like I mentioned, we're going to control for the size of the police force with information from the census on state and local law enforcement agencies. And so our, excuse me, our framework here is leveraging that variation in the applications we use. The staggered difference in difference framework, right? Because we have this 20-year period, and we have the timing of the policy varies across that time. And so we set it up in this basic difference in difference framework. We've done it in more kind of simplistic, like your kind of straightforward D&D approach. But what we're most substantively interested in here is that delta, which this guy, which right is going to tell us the extent to which segregation differed between those implemented and those rejected counties. And then we think of this, as I've tried to argue, this is at least kind of a plausibly causal estimate of this program on segregation. Okay, and so when we do that, this is what we find. We find that the 287G program was associated with an increase in segregation of about 1.7 percentage points. Now, that might seem small, 1.7 percentage points on a scale of 100 does maybe seem small, but it's also in the context of declines in segregation, that's actually about a third. Do the math. It's about a third of the decline in segregation over that period. Okay, and so it's not actually the case that this program wasn't. It's not that segregation was higher in these areas. It was that the reductions in segregation were depressed in these communities. You can also do some like back of the envelope calculations on like what that would mean in terms of like the number of impacted families. And that 1.7% translates to, depending on the size of the community, but if you have a Latino population, and like the median county has a Latino population of like 19,000 people, that translates to something like 370 families would be impacted by this. And so again, that doesn't seem like a huge effect, but it seems like a plausible effect in the sense of how these sorts of policies might impact communities and maybe not huge, but still impactful for those communities and those families. And so we can reduce it a little bit through some of the controls that we include, but it still remains. Now we can also look at Black, white, and Latino Black segregation, right? We would assume that there'd be no impact on white Black segregation, which is exactly what we find. There's no difference in that. This policy wasn't associated with any difference in Black, white segregation or in Latino Black segregation. There might be arguments to think that it would affect segregation between Latinos and Blacks. We don't see any evidence of that. Yeah.
How does it count for like Afro-Latinos?
So we're using census data on this, and so we're defining Latino ethnicity just based on any race. So we're not distinguishing between Afro-Latinos and others. I doubt we would have the power to test that, but it's a good question, or at least but could look, for instance, at how different communities with different presence of Afro-Latino populations were impacted. Something we could look into.
When doing the staggered diff and diff, do you compare these with counties that never took the program? Or you're going to compare, for example, 1 year with those that are going to get the program in the next year?
Yeah, we only, like, I mean, it's only to the counties that, so the places that never applied are not included at all. Okay, it's only the places that ever applied. And the control group are the places that were what we're calling rejected. Okay? Like there's some subtleties to this, because there are some cases that places will withdraw and then apply and be accepted. There are places that apply and then, or that are accepted and then subsequently withdraw. So we've kind of set it up in a way that is kind of makes the most sense in this time series. But yeah, we're not including here, at least in what I'm showing you here, that places that never applied.
And it's also the yet to enter 287, which you can see in the control group as the time series.
Yes, yes, yeah. Okay, now we also, as I mentioned, we looked at how the policy impacted segregation based on a few different factors. One was the timing of the policy, and as we kind of we suspected that, or we hypothesized that the policy would be most impactful for those that adopted during that kind of the Mecklenburg County era, both because of the intensity in the program, but also because of the timing of the program. You know, we kind of see that, but it's the difference between these is not statistically significant. So we can't really confidently assume that there's a meaningful difference between them. What we do see a difference is between the southern and, this should say non-southern. This is the southern region, and this is outside of South. And we see that the association really is limited to southern communities.
The timing of adoption, or how long they stayed with the of the period that they
Yeah.
information. I mean, a little.
That's mostly going to be the same thing. Yeah, mostly like I said, there are some subtleties to it. For the most part, you know, where like the timing gets a little trickier is not so much in like the community's participation in the program, but ICE's involvement. And so that's going to be more fixed, you know, over that time period. Like during certain eras, the ICE coordination with local communities, all local 287 agreements may have been higher or lower. Yeah, we can test that more formally, but yeah.
No, so you can have a county that started the program, stay for 2 years and get out, and then go back? Or no? You could.
You could. We don't have that happen in our case. Yeah.
Okay, so all of the counties that you're comparing here, they stay for, let's say, 2 or 3 years, 4 years?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at exactly I don't want to misspeak that, you know, like there might be one county that did that. Like the kind of the modal experience is either they begin the policy and then continue throughout the time series, or at least they continue for a long stretch, you know, 10, 12, 15 years.
We could just take the number of years.
Yeah.
Adopted, and I mean, just look at that parameter.
Yeah, we can do that easily. Yeah, see, it's a good idea. Again, we make this distinction between the jail-based and the kind of the task force or police force models. We expected all the action to be in the police force models. That's not what we see. I mean, we do see that you know, the coefficient is larger there, but it's not statistically different. You know, this is against what we expected, but there is some work on the Migration Policy Institute that suggests that that what was written on paper about how these agreements were meant to be structured was not always what happened on the ground. And so that they were kind of, you know, that's like what we think of as a jail-based program might have actually looked more like a police-based program, or vice versa. And so we don't know, this is kind of our best measure of the best all we have on kind of distinguishing between these kinds of places, but it didn't, from their qualitative work, it didn't actually go to the on-the-ground realities of how these programs were being implemented. What we do find is kind of as we expected, that the areas that had more detainers, right, where deportations are assumed to be higher, had a larger impact, right? So this is kind of our clear evidence that the intensity of the program actually did matter, even if it wasn't being reflected in the kind of the type of agreement that was signed. I won't spend too much time here, but just to say that we've looked at this in a few different ways and looking at comparing counties that are kind of areas that implemented the area versus areas that were spatially adjacent to it. The results are largely the same when you do it like this. We've also scaled it instead of to counties to metro and micropolitan divisions or areas, and the results are largely consistent with what we did here. Now, and then lastly, as I mentioned, we explore these different migration mechanisms as one of the pathways or the main pathway that should lead to the segregation effects. So what we show here, so this is we split the data into at median migration levels for what we're calling low migration and high migration. And we are doing it for out migration, which is an estimate of the number of Latinos that left an area. There's a little more to it than that, but that's kind of the basic measure of it. And then an ACS measure of residential moves within a county. And again, we just split these at the median to make this kind of through distinction. And what you can see that in both cases, that the areas that had high out-migration and that had higher local mobility are the places where these impacts were higher, were heightened. So, you know, the point being that we think that migration is in fact the pathway as we suspected it would be, through which the segregation is changing. Okay, and so, you know, our just to wrap things up, we see this as you know, plausibly causal evidence that immigration enforcement at least slowed the decline in segregation relative to areas with the stated interest in detention. As this typo, it says 50%, it's 30%, 33%. Smaller declines in Latino white segregation in 287G areas. Again, we didn't find any evidence that this existed for Black-white segregation or for Latino-Black segregation. The effects were stronger, although not statistically so, in what we think of as the more aggressive or the early adopters, especially in the New South and in areas where there were more detainers. This is also a carryover from an old slide, so you ignore the spatial spillovers. And you know, we have some evidence that this kind of works through these migration pathways. We think that these estimates are probably conservative, and that's because, you know, the design itself is quite tight, right? We're limiting only to those areas that had this kind of taste for enforcement. And so if we think that those same communities that didn't implement 287G might be doing other things that are adding to chilling effects within their communities, right? That's going to attenuate the difference between those two areas. And obviously, you know, the scale at which we're thinking about immigration activity and deportations at this time period is dwarfed by what's happening today. And so, you know, the potential impact could be quite larger. But the implication is that, you know, this has, to the extent to which we think that segregation matters, not only for resources, for access to education, for access to healthcare, to exposure to hazards, but also for the kinds of social connections that people have in forming friendships and dating partners, relationships, right? The segregation matters. And so the extent to which a policy like this is going to reduce segregation, is also going to stall integration. And this obviously has long-term consequences for integration, for the next generation and for social mobility. So I will pause there. Happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Just comments?
There, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a couple of questions. I'm curious about whether you considered incorporating to count PL280 for the states that incorporate it. So I know that Arizona was one of the ones that's highlighted, both those who have rejected, rejected the 287 as well as incorporated a lot more. But that's also a state that has a lot more tribal nations, which means you already have a lot more federal law enforcement present in a lot of these areas. A lot of states that have, or counties that had adopted it, it is a PL280 state. So you again already have these local police departments having a lot more authority than one. I wonder if that kind of mitigated some of these results.
We haven't looked at that at all. It's a great idea. And it's something that we can, I think we can probably try to take a look at.
It'd be interesting.
Yeah.
And my second question is on the, so at the very end, you're talking about the out migration, but are you able to distinguish between in and out migration, or are you using net migration?
Using that migration, yeah, and that's because you can't, it's actually, good marketers know, it's very difficult to get in and out of those by race. So we're using measures of that migration here.
And I'm sorry, one more. Because I think you're using Rochelle Winkler's data set on net migration. So she has an updated one that breaks down a little bit more of the race differences, and it includes the American Indian, Alaska Native, which could also play a role in some of your states that are using the tribal nations.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question.
This is a simple sort of functional form question. You chose in the results you presented to always have dichotomous choices: high out migration, low migration, high detainees, low detainees. Is that because you know that's the way the world is, or might there be? You're saying there's no marginal effect below the median, no marginal effect above the median, it's just whether you're below or above. Why do you?
It's just for simplification purposes. It's just, it's a small sample. I know that we've calculated the marginal effects for all of these. It's just a presentation choice to try to simplify the results.
Yeah, I just not sure how to know if this is better than some alternative.
Thought about looking at driving things in the same PCS data, but looking at like the span 16 and over, using one of the kind of estimates of driving popular. What you might find
Back to look at places where there's more movement, right?
Yeah, but basically, like if people feel they're being targeted, you would expect to find that population or changing the estimate.
Oh, we changed it.
Yeah, a change in estimate.
Oh,
that
okay, yeah.
population. A rational response, which is fewer people driving on the road, they know that they're actually at risk.
Good. No, we haven't done that, but we gave you.
And the other thing is just, if it's a sheriff is the primary serving law enforcement agency that that signs the MOU, but you have a cater. Because in some counties, you might have several agencies that aren't part of 287G. So you might expect a bigger effect in the county where it's the sheriff of the primary. So yeah. I mean, I know there's only so many ways you can split the data. like LA County, you said was rejected, but like LAPD is not gonna participate in this.
Right.
But the county, some of the county agencies would, but LAPD drives the county, so like in that case, you know, when you expect as big of an event, with like, you know, a county where it's like the, say, you know, we'll go on where the sheriffs are the primary line.
Created as well.
I had two questions, and this was great to hear. The first is a methods question about segregation declining. So for like the staggered DID parallel trends assumption, is that the case across all of these counties that segregation was declining before 287G?
Yeah, and I don't have the event study to show up here, but we did actually take the analysis back to 1990 as well. And you
Okay.
can see that there is like there's a slight level difference between those areas. It's actually it's the opposite of what you would expect, that the implemented counties had slightly lower segregation than the rejected counties. But the trends, that pre-trend is a short pre-trend, you know, 1990 to 2000, they look similar.
Across the board, cool. And then second, you were using the black-white segregation as like a placebo test, but I had a question about Asian white segregation, because there's a substantial population of undocumented people among Asians, but they're not as visible to immigrant enforcement systems. And so I wonder if these results if the results for Asian white segregation would look the same as the black-white segregation, or if there were noted impacts among Asian immigrants too.
Yeah, it's a great question as well. The challenge is there's just relatively few counties, you know, where you can like confidently estimate, where you have enough of an Asian and a Latino population in order to distinguish between those two. I mean, we could, I know we've done this at one point. I want to say it's something like 50 counties. You can calculate that. I can't remember what the results were, but they weren't kind of important or enough that they kind of reported in there. But it's a great question. Yeah, and there's a related issue with like cities. So Mark Fawcett, for instance, the late Mark Fawcett has had recently done some really phenomenal work on how to calculate segregation in small areas, and found that the dissimilarity score that we're using here is biased. And so we've done a bunch of different robustness checks using the tools that he's developed, along with other measures like the separation index. They all point in the same direction. The magnitudes are a little bit larger. Actually, the conventional D is like kind of the midpoint of those different estimates. But it's all to say that like whenever you're calculating segregation for small populations, especially in small areas, they can be real prone to both measurement error as a result of census data swapping, differential privacy, but also some of the index bias that comes in with these measures. Yeah.
So very interesting. Thank you for your talk. I find the piece about the intervening or the mechanisms really interesting, and I've been pondering what it means that the outmigration, communities with further outmigration are having smaller declines in integration. The first impulse is to say, well, those who are leaving were those that were most integrated. But it also makes me wonder about your controls and, you know, what counties are losing for those Latino residents, and, you know, what kinds of places. So can you tell us a little bit about your controls in general, what kinds of counties, aside from immigration enforcement, what kinds of places saw the biggest segregation? How does that really?
Yeah, I don't know if I know the answer to that question. It's a good one. We can certainly.
It seems like unusual to lose Latinos, right? The Latino population continues to grow throughout this period. It just makes me wonder about some of the underlying things that are going on.
Yeah. It's something that I can look into. I don't know off the top of my head what those are, but I think your assumption is exactly correct. Right? All of the results through, it suggests, this is exactly what Tara Watson found, you know, in her earlier work, that it was actually the more integrated, the higher the yeah, exactly, they had options, they had income to leave.
I think my question kind of relates to what she said in terms of the parallel trends. And I'm not sure if that was actually that one. But can you test some kind of anticipation effect? Like if there is a county say, I don't want Latinos here, we know they're going to apply. So then you could kind of see some kind of anticipation that I'm not going to that county, I go to another one. And I'm not sure if these counties can also be your control, right? You see, and maybe, for example, you have two counties that are very similar in terms of, I don't know, maybe share of Hispanic, and then one anticipates because there is, I don't know, like a different political speech in this county, and then I just say, okay, if they start doing these things about deportation, I'm going to be messed up, so I then go to the other country. So I don't know how, I mean, probably it's very complex to see these inflows, outflows, but some kind of anticipation effect could be also, I think, tied to what you said in the framework, right? Like just the terror that I don't want Brazilians, I'm not going to that place, like they don't want me, right? So I think if there is some kind of anticipation effect, you can try to test.
No, we could do that. We could look kind of more clearly at those areas that eventually apply, and look at how they relate. A little bit of the challenge is that, you know, we have 3 data points, right? You know, because we only can calculate segregation in the decennial years. So we don't have a lot of runway to work with. But we might be able to slice the sample up in a way that can kind of lead to the same conclusions.
I'm sorry, I guess I find the fundamental point counterintuitive. If enforcement is driving this, the easiest way for me as a local cop to enforce deportations is to go to the communities, the neighborhoods that have the most Mexicans in them. Okay, so I'm looking around, you know, what's the easiest way for me to, you know, rack up a whole bunch of arrests or deportations or whatever score I'm supposed to get. Again, this is not my values talking, I'm talking about a law enforcement person who's participating in this kind of thing. And it's, if I'm understanding this right, the opposite's happening. You're getting people, you're enforcing this most in the least densely populated. And that's what's driving this change.
It depends, you know, yes, I get that it's potentially counterintuitive, but the important point, I think, is that these policies not only impact those families that are experiencing deportation, but there are broader effects that are responsive to them. So, you know, there is, in, you know, the removal of somebody is certainly going to be, you know, a direct impact. But if we're following the results, it might suggest that the broader community effects that are leading to people to make different migration decisions, regardless of whether they've been impacted directly by deportation themselves, might outweigh those direct detection events.
Well, I had a rough question now to see to get your reactions. You still look at India, and Obama is still much happier. I don't even follow the data these days, but it's just different than Trump. First Trump for you, or have you? I mean, it's yeah. I want to ask about, you know, like how do you see enforcement these days? It's like it's hard to separate the rhetoric from the practice. I know you've been looking at, you have been following the numbers of deportations. Is it going to be like, is Obama going to stay up there as the deporting chief, or are we going to
I think Trump certainly has aspirations to, to exceed those numbers, and I think everything we're seeing is that there's on a path to do that. I mean, I don't know. You know, the Trump 2.0 immigration enforcement is drastically different than it was in the first, the first administration. I mean, that first administration was largely a continuation of Obama policies. There were changes in priorities, but not nearly to the extent that we've already seen take place today. Like the reliance on worksite raids, you know, is that's actually an area that has really grown quite rapidly over the past 7 or 8 months. And so everything that I'm seeing, and regardless of whether it's data or we don't have good data on it, we have reported data from this administration. We have news reports that all points to a much more aggressive approach.
Okay, so we run out of time. Okay, thank you, Madam.